book of Daniel. This will just be probably introduction if I can get that far. The book of Daniel has 12 chapters. 12 chapters and about 357 verses. The book of Daniel is the book of Revelation. You've got the book of Revelation in the New Testament. The book of Daniel is the book of Revelation in the Old Testament. So a lot of people study the book of Revelation for prophecy, and then they'll go to the book of Daniel. I'll tell you what the book of Daniel will do. The book of Daniel will take you from, if you've ever noticed in the middle of your Bible, you've got that space between Malachi and Matthew. There's 400 years there. The book of Daniel will take you from that particular time all the way to the first coming of Christ. History from the end of the Old Testament to the first coming of Christ. Well, Revelation will take you from the end of the New Testament all the way to the second coming of Christ. So that's the way they come together. You almost have to have both of them laying side by side to get a lot of the information. The book of Daniel has been criticized from a lot of people. Like, if you remember when we studied the book of Jonah, they criticized. Jonah has no place in the Bible and all this kind of thing. Well, they do the same thing with Daniel. But here's something interesting. If you'll remember, Jesus Christ in Matthew 12:40 mentions Jonah, as Jonah was 3 days, 3 nights in the bells, well, so on and so forth. Well, I think I've got this in Matthew 24:15. Jesus says, as it is, well, let me just go over there. Matthew 24, I'll read it for you. And I trust Jesus. If he says Daniel wrote it, then I trust that. Matthew 24, let me read verse 15. When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. So, Jesus said Daniel belonged in there. So, it doesn't matter what the critics say. We have the Word of God. The book of Daniel, the word Daniel, his name means God is my judge. If you'll notice, you're looking there on the screen there, that El on the end of Daniel. In the Hebrew, if you remember, Elohim. Elohim is the Hebrew name for God. So you've got God on the end, Dan. God is judge. God is my judge. And that's what Daniel, the word Daniel means. It was written in Babylon. Now, let me give you some background real quick. Daniel, when he went into Babylonian captivity, he was about 15 or 16 years old. Can you imagine that? 15 or 16 years old, a teenager, going into Babylonian captivity. Now, let me give you a little history so you'll know. When I say Daniel, you'll have the background of it. Obviously, you remember King David. King David, of course, before him was King Saul. After King Saul, King David. King David, after he passed off the scene, his son, King Solomon, took over. King Solomon started off really good. He was a good king, worshiped God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then later on, if you remember, Solomon had so many wives and in the Old Testament. And he had all of these wives, and some of these wives were their religious background. It does matter who you marry. It affects who you marry. And so some of his wives were of the pagan religion. So over time, his wives had a lot of influence on him, and by the end of Solomon, he started worshiping paganism, golden calves, things like that. Well, God says, Solomon, when you die, I'm going to split the kingdom. And so God starts judging the nation of Israel. The 12 tribes of Israel split. 10 tribes, the northern tribes, is called the nation of Israel. Sometimes in the Old Testament, when you're reading the Old Testament, it'll say, and Israel did this, and Israel did that. And then other times it would say, and Judah did this, and Judah did that. Well, by that, you will know, okay, he's talking about the 10 tribes. If he uses the word Israel, he's talking about the 10 northern tribes. The 2 southern tribes, he calls Judah. They both split. Then, and all of this stuff, look, some of this stuff might be boring to you. I like it myself. But the king of the northern tribes, his name was Jeroboam. Jeroboam. He was the first king of the northern tribe. And then the southern tribe, Rehoboam. Now, that's why sometimes the Old Testament is real confusing, because Jeroboam, Jehoiakim, and Rehoboam, and all this, you just get confused. So all of these kings, Rehoboam took over the southern tribes, and Jeroboam took over the northern tribes, and then that's where you have 1st and 2nd Kings and all of that kind of thing. Now, here's something I want you to, let me finish what I started to say about that. The 10 northern tribes went on in about 722 BC. Now, what that means is 722 years before Christ. Before Christ showed up, 700 years, the 10 northern tribes went into Assyrian captivity. If y'all will remember the study of Jonah, when we talked about Jonah, there's Jonah right there. Jonah wrote about a city called Nineveh, which was the capital of Assyria. Remember I told you God wanted Jonah to go to Nineveh and preach to these people? And Jonah's like, they're our enemies. And so that's why Jonah had so much a hard time with that. Jonah wrote about Nineveh, that city of captivity, the Syrian captivity. Then the southern tribes, they go along and they go into Babylonian captivity about 606 years before Christ shows up. Now, let me give you this. Get this in your mind, and then we'll get into the book of Daniel. In your Old Testament, you got all them Old Testament books. We sort of went through this when we were talking about the Old Testament survey. You got Obadiah, Joel, Jonah, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Micah, Nahum, Zephaniah, Habakkuk. You've got 3 types of prophets in the Old Testament. Some prophets prophesied before Israel goes into captivity. In other words, these prophets are saying, y'all better get right. Get right, get right. God's fixing to get really upset at us if we don't get back on track, get back right with God, start doing the thing, all that kind of thing. That's what these guys, they're called pre-exile prophets. In other words, before exile. These are your pre-exile prophets. Then you've got Jeremiah, Lamentations, Daniel, Ezekiel. These are exile prophets. In other words, they write within the 70 years of captivity of Babylon. Daniel, what we're fixing to read, 70 years of Babylonian captivity. Jeremiah starts writing before they go into captivity, and the rest of Jeremiah, that's why, you know why they call Jeremiah the weeping prophet. You know why they call him the weeping prophet? He's weeping over the nation of Israel. He sees what's coming. And he weeps over the nation of Israel because he knows they're fixing to go into captivity. Lamentation. What is lamenting? Lamentations. Crying out to God. Jeremiah, Lamentations, Daniel, Ezekiel was written in the captivity while the nation of Israel was in Babylonian captivity. And then Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi were post exile. In other words, they were written after Israel comes back in the land. I'll give you, for instance, remember in Nehemiah chapter number 2, God gives the command to rebuild the temple. Where? In Jerusalem. They're out of captivity. They're now back in the land. They're starting to rebuild that temple, the walls of the city that Babylon destroyed. They're rebuilding that stuff. So, you got in the purple, you got pre-exile prophets. In the red, you got exile prophets. And in the blue, you got post-exile prophets. Does that make sense? You got some written before Israel goes into captivity, during, and then after. Okay? Right. Now, hopefully that was easy to understand. That sort of gives you, so when I say we're going to start the study of the book of Daniel, you'll know that Israel is in captivity under Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Darius, and so on and so forth. We'll get into all of that. Now let's look. I'm trying to make sure if there's anything else I want to touch on. Okay, let me show you this. Let me show you this map real quick. If you can see that, I know hopefully there you can at home. Here's Babylon, and here's Jerusalem, nation of Israel. So when Babylon conquers this area, Babylon goes over here and they go over there and deport Israel 3 different times. The first trip, they get the cream of the crop, okay? Second trip, third trip and all of that. But the first trip, they get the cream of the crop. So when they go over there and get Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, all of those guys, and then they bring them into Babylon and start teaching them the ways of Babylon, pagan religion, and all of that kind of thing. And Daniel writes about that. There's 12 chapters. The first 6 chapters talks about historically them being in the land. The last 6 chapters talks about prophetic in the future, the times of the Gentiles, all of that kind of thing. Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Darius, Cyrus were some of the kings that were mentioned there. Let's see. Let me give you just a couple other things. Now, you may be wondering, here's something interesting that I wanted to point out. You may be wondering why did God allow Israel to go into captivity for 70 years? Why? I mean, it seems like God, why would he do that to his own people? You understand? Well, sometimes God has to punish us to get us to come back to him, right? Okay. So for 490 years, Israel did not keep the Sabbath, did not keep the Jubilee year. Every 7th year is the year of Jubilee. You ever heard that in the Old Testament? The year of Jubilee. Every 7th year, the land rested. It's called the year of Jubilee. They didn't keep it. They didn't keep Passover. They didn't do nothing. They just forsook all the things that God told them to do. Okay? Watch. So for every 7th year, they did not keep that year of Jubilee. Okay? You take 7 and divide it into 490. Somebody tell me what you get. 70 years of captivity. He gave them 1 year for every 7th that they failed to keep the year of Jubilee. And he put them in captivity for 70 years. You see that? Now, that's the reason. Because he's trying to get their attention. Now, let's look at the book of Daniel. We got a 15 or 16-year-old boy writing here, and he covers probably, by the time you get to the end of Daniel, Daniel's probably, I think Daniel probably lives to be about 90 years old, but by the time you get to the end of Daniel, he's probably 70, something like that. So there's your 70, 80, 90, somewhere along in there, okay? Now, let's look at Daniel chapter 1 and verse number 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, what? King of Judah, say, king of Judah. So we know we're in the southern tribe, the 2 tribes of the nation of Israel. The top 10 tribes are already in the Syrian captivity. They went 722. This is 606, which is later. And so, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem to besiege it. There we go. They're going into Babylonian captivity. Verse 2, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, small G-O-D, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. Now, there's a couple things I want to point out in verse 2. The land of Shinar. The land of Shinar, you'll find that in Genesis chapter number 11. Y'all remember? God called Abraham and wanted to make Abraham a great nation, the nation of Israel. He calls Abraham out of the Ur of Chaldees. That's the land of Shinar. God brought Abraham out of that land to bring a nation and create a nation to be a powerhouse in this world. Well, obviously, they disobeyed God. They wouldn't keep his commandments and all this kind of thing. So God puts them back in captivity of where he called them out from. Shinar. To the house. Now, notice what Nebuchadnezzar does. When Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, goes into Jerusalem to besiege it, to take it, and start carrying Jews back to Babylon. Y'all remember we just did a study on the tabernacle, right? 7 pieces of furniture in the tabernacle, right? Nebuchadnezzar goes into that temple, the temple of Solomon, and starts taking the golden lampstand. He starts taking the table of showbread. He starts taking the altar of incense, and he takes it back to Babylon and puts it in his temple to the false gods. Don't you know the God of heaven was upset about that? There's a sermon you can preach right here, and I think I've heard Dad preach it before, putting your hands, laying your hands unworthily on the things of God. And you better be just careful of what you take for granted. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar took these things, put them into the house of his God, and brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. Verse 3. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz. Ashpenaz. Now you say, is that proper pronunciation? You don't know the difference. Well, I hope you don't. It looks good to me, right? Okay. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes. Now, let me say a couple things about verse 3. Eunuchs. Eunuchs are men that cannot have children, okay? Men that cannot have children. So what King Nebuchadnezzar or any Babylonian king would do, he would put eunuchs, men that couldn't have children, over all of his possessions, including his wives, including his concubines. Why would you put a man that can't have children and to watch over your wives? Because he can't have kids, right? It's safe. Does everybody get that? So that's what they used these eunuchs for. The master, this Ashpenaz, he was the master, he was over all the eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes. So they go over there. Ashpenaz, this guy that's over it, he goes into Jerusalem over here, and he gets the cream of the crop. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And according to Isaiah 39, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were of the tribe of Judah, were of the kingly line. If you remember, Jesus was of the tribe of Judah. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, of the same tribe of Judah, so they come from a kingly line. So they are the cream of the crop. So they took them first because they're the king's seed and of the princes. You notice that? And that's found in Isaiah 39, 5 through 7. If we had time, I'd go look at it. But that's where it's at. Verse 4, children in whom was no blemish. All right, he didn't have no pimples, no blackheads on his face, no dark spots. I mean, they were children with no blemish, well-favored, and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, notice, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans, the land of Shinar, that's where Abraham got called out from. Now they're back in Babylon, and so what King Nebuchadnezzar does, he gets the cream of the crop from the nation of Israel, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, along with others. He gets them to come over. They're already learned. They're already smart. They're already understand science and all of that kind of thing. They bring them in, put them in their school in Babylon, and teach them the ways of the pagan, teach them the ways of Babylon, and in other words, reprogram them, or at least try to. Reprogram them, get the things of God out of their mind, and get the things of Babylon and reprogram them and all of that kind of thing. In a minute, we're going to see he changed their name, he changes their diet, he changes all of this kind of thing. Why? Trying to reprogram them and make them Babylonians, if you will. Okay? So that's what the King Nebuchadnezzar is trying to do. All right, look at verse number 5. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now, notice, they start feeding them from the king's table. I mean, not, the good steak, good stuff, okay? Probably he may have given them or tried to give them some pork. Well, Jews, can't eat pork, right? Jews had dietary laws, they had dress laws, they had certain way they had to dress, they had certain things they had to eat, and certain things they had to keep. Well, they come into Babylonian captivity, and so the king, what they would do, they would feed them, fatten them up for 3 years. You understand? Give them king's meat, give them the wine straight off the king's table, all this kind of good stuff. And to us, we're like, man, that's good. But to Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that wasn't good. Now, watch. Verse number 6. Now among these were the children of Judah, right? Judah, right here. Judah. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Y'all see those? Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were the Jewish names of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Okay? Remember I told you they changed their names? Watch. Verse 7. Unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, For he gave unto Daniel the name of Belshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and unto Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. So he brought these Jewish boys over here, fed them different food, changed their name. They're trying to reprogram them, right? You follow me? 15, 16-year-old boys. Okay? Now, let me give you the, I wrote somewhere, hang on, don't go to commercial. All right, Daniel, we already know. Daniel is his Jewish name, and it means that God is my judge. Notice they changed his name to Belshazzar, Baal, B-E-L, Baal. Y'all ever heard of Baal worship? Belshazzar means whom Baal protects and favors. Hananiah was Shadrach's Jewish name. Hananiah means beloved of the Lord. But Shadrach, Babylonian name, means illuminated by the sun god. Mishael, the Jewish name, light of the Lord. Meshach, who is like Venus, pagan, you see. Azariah was his Jewish name, Lord is my helper. They changed his name to Abednego, the servant of Nego, which is something that has to do with wisdom or something. Anyway. So this is what they changed their names to. They changed their diet. They're trying to reprogram these boys, give them Babylonian names, Babylonian diet. They're trying to take God out of them. But you're saying, I know what you're saying. You're thinking, okay, where are we going with this? Hey. And you're thinking, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, okay, how are these boys going to live for God in a foreign pagan land? Well, the rest of the chapter, we're fixing to find out that they do it. Which means, in the pagan world that we live in, you can live for God. You hear everybody say, boy, it's so tough, live for God in these days. It's so bad. Think about a 15 or 16-year-old boy being brought to the land of Babylon. It changed his name, changed his food, put him in a strange land that he knows nothing about, and he still lives for God. That means we can do it. We can do it. Yes, we have to live in this world, but we don't have to be of the world. Daniel had to live in Babylon, but he didn't have to be of Babylon. He was just living in Babylon, but he wasn't trying to be of Babylon. Y'all know the difference? Now, let's look. Verse 8, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. All right, y'all are thinking, I know what you're thinking. I can read your mind. How is Daniel going to get out of this? Because if he don't eat the king's meat, they put him in the lion's den. If he don't eat the king's meat, they'll put him in the lion's den. They'll throw him in a fiery furnace. They'll cut his head off. They'll do something. How's he going to get out of this? Now, just remember this. Y'all remember there's a verse over in Romans 8 and verse 28, and it says, for we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose. If you're trying to live right and do right, you'll have the favor of God on you. And he'll make a way. Let's see. Verse 9. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. Now, this reminds me of a story that we preached on Sunday mornings. Y'all remember the story of Joseph and the coat of many colors? His brothers sold him into slavery, threw him in the pit. he gets out, he goes into Potiphar's house. Potiphar falls in love with Joseph, makes him ruler of his whole house. Remember that? And then his wife falsely accused him. Potiphar throws him into prison. In the prison, people just fall in love with Joseph. And matter of fact, Joseph worked his way up, and now he's over the whole prison. Then he gets out of prison because he tells a dream of Pharaoh's, and Pharaoh puts him in second in command. Everywhere Joseph went, God had his hand of provision and protection and favor on him. What about Moses? Y'all remember Moses? Moses was raised by Pharaoh in Pharaoh's house under pagan religion. And when Moses got of age, Hebrews tells us he got tired of that, living the ways of the world, and wound up leaving and leading the children of Israel. So you can live for God in a wicked society. Now, watch what Daniel does. Daniel says he's done found favor with the prince over the eunuchs there. Now, look at verse 10. The prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meal and your drink, for why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall he make me endanger my head to the king. Now, you're saying, what in the world does that mean? Okay. The prince over the eunuchs that's over Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel says, we don't want to eat that. We don't want to drink that. Can we have something else? And so the prince of the eunuch is saying, if I don't fatten you up and you look like the rest of these guys, the king is going to bring you in 3 years. And if you don't look fattened up, if you don't look healthy, if you don't look like the rest of these guys that's ate his meat and drank his wine, he'll have my head. So Daniel, you're going to have to eat this. Now watch. Verse 11. Then said Daniel to Melchizedek, which is the prince of the eunuchs, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servant. Now, prove means to try. Prove thy servants, I beseech thee, I beg thee, I beseech thee. 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Now, I know what you think. There's a couple things in verse 12 I want to pull out. Number one, prove thyself, like I said, try, give it, I beseech thee, I beg thee, 10 days, give me 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Pulse. Now, in the King James, that's an old, what they call an archaic word that we don't use anymore, but you can look that up in an 1828 Webster's Dictionary, and it'll tell you what pulse is. Pulse is vegetable beans like green beans, white beans, brown beans, pinto beans, black-eyed peas, vegetables that are beans, lima beans. You get the picture. I don't think Daniel was trying to become a vegetarian, but he was trying to keep from defiling himself. You see? So what he does, he says, hey, give us 10 days. Just feed us beans and water for 10 days, and then you bring us in, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and me, and you compare us to your other servants that you fed steak and wine to, and give me 10 days, and you compare us and see if we look weaker, stronger, whatever. Just give us 10 days. Now, in numerology, 10 is the Gentile number. 10 is the number for the Gentiles. Now, I'm going to look at one verse because it remember I told you, it goes Daniel and Revelation go hand in hand. I'm going to go to Revelation 2 and verse 10 and read you something that may clear something up. Revelation 2 and verse 10 is what it says. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison. Sounds like Daniel. That ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Isn't that odd? And thou be faithful unto death, I will give thee a crown of life. This is a picture of the nation of Israel. Daniel, the nation of Israel, being tried for those 10 days. Now, over in Revelation, that's probably 10 persecutions and all that kind of thing. But you see how that thing is tied together, the number 10. You're fixing to see number 10 show up a couple more times. Verse 13 of Daniel 1. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, as thou seest, deal with thy servants. I just told you about that. So he consented to them in this manner, and to prove them 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their countenance appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Look at there. All these guys, all Daniel and them had was vegetable beans, whatever kind of beans it was, and water. These guys are eating steak and wine. And Daniel and them look fatter and fairer than those guys. You with me? God's favor, his hand of protection, just like Joseph, just like Moses, is on them when you're trying to do right. Now, when you're trying to do right, God will have his hand of favor on you. Now, let me say something about eating things. The reason that Daniel and those Jews didn't want to eat anything of Babylonian food is because, all right, we go get a burger from McDonald's, Sonic, a number 2, double cheese, hallelujah, woo, you know, hey, from Sonic. You know, you trace that thing back. We got farmers around here that raise cows. They kill the cow, this, that, and the other, whatever, and it winds up between 2 pieces of bread. Okay? But in Babylon, before it got to your plate, they took that meat, that cow, into their sanctuary, their temple, with their false gods, and offered that meat up to a strange god. Well, a Jew ain't going to eat that. Now, you're thinking, well, how do we know that we're eating what we're in the New Testament? Remember 1 Thessalonians? What we eat, what do? If it be received with thanksgiving, you bow your head, Lord, I'm asking you to bless. I don't know where this come from. I don't know whose hand's been on it. But Lord, I'm praying you to bless this food to the nurse of my body. Don't let me get sick. That's why you better pray over your food. You better pray over it. But now in the Old Testament, those Jews had dietary laws. They couldn't eat that stuff sacrificed unto idols. And so that's why Daniel's like, hey, can we do something a little different? And just see if we're just as fat or whatever as them other guys. And it come out. God showed his favor on them. Now, look at verse number 16. Thus, Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink and gave them pulse. As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. You remember Joseph? Joseph interpreted dreams. That's how he got out of prison. That's how he got out of into Pharaoh's house. It's just they compare very well. Daniel. Now, let me just say this before we finish up here. You may be thinking, I wonder how dumb these people are. I wonder how dumb these people are in Babylon. Or I wonder how dumb, Daniel. Because we're pretty sophisticated in the age we live in now. And, but remember this. These, even in Babylon, they were not stupid people. They were very smart. Daniel, very intelligent. Matter of fact, y'all remember the 3 wise men? I say 3. I don't know how many there were. I just know they brought 3 gifts. But there were wise men that came from the east in search of the King of the Jews. How did they figure out where Jesus was going to be born? And the star that appeared in the sky, astronomy. Is that astronomy? Astrology? Astronomy? What's the study of the... Somebody help me. Is astrology or astronomy? Astronomy, okay. They studied that kind of stuff in the atmosphere and the outer... Hey, and they figured out where Jesus was going. Them guys were smart. So was Daniel. Give them the wisdom and all of that kind of thing. All right, now look at verse number, 18. Now at the end of the days, in other words, the end of the 3 years, that the king had said he should bring them in. Then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, after 3 years, he's going to fatten them up, he's going to look at them, and decide where he's going to put them in his kingdom and use them. Verse 19, and the king communed with them. And among them all was found none like David, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. Now, you say, what does all that stuff mean? Well, all right, number 1, God had his hand favor on Daniel and the 3 Hebrew boys. They come in before the king, and the king notices there's none any better than these boys. There's none any better, none any fairer. And the Bible says that, therefore stood they before the king. Hey, what do you do when you come in the presence of a king? What are you supposed to do? Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood before the king. Why? Because he found favor with them, and he didn't make them do what he makes everybody else do. When you're trying to live for God, even in a pagan society, you can do it. God will make a way where there seems to be no way. Look at here, verse 20. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better. Look at there, 10 times, 10, Gentile number, 10 times better than all the magicians, the astrologers that were in all his realm. Look at there. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You say, why do you keep calling them? Those names are easier to pronounce than their Hebrew names. 10 times better than all their musicians, or magicians, astrologers, that were in all his realm. Verse 21, and Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. That's like 70 years later. So what you have, now, let me say this, just introduction. You remember when we were dealing with, and I'm coming down the close. You remember when we dealt with the book of Revelation and we talked about how Revelation is not in chronological order? You'll go through this and then you'll come back and start over again. All right. Daniel chapter 1 took you through the whole reign of Babylon and Medes and the Persians. You with me? The whole 70 years. Then in chapter 2, we're going to go back. So it does a lot of the same things that the book of Revelation does. Now, chapter 1 was fairly easy to get all of that and divide all of that up. Now, chapter number 2, there's an image that's going to show up. It's a 6 by 6 by 6. And he's going to look something like that dude right there. And it's one of those, it's going to start, the book of Daniel is full, packed full of prophecy and end time stuff This thing got the head of gold, the breast of silver, bronze, the legs of iron, is it? The 10 toes on this thing, the 10 confederated nations that's going to show up in the tribulation period. Hey, you don't want to miss it. Next Wednesday night, hopefully. Any question or comment about? Oh, let me say here's something I wrote down that I thought was very interesting. Changing a man's name does not change his character. You can change a man's name, you can change his character, or change his name, change his diet, but that don't change his character. Daniel was still who he was. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was still who they were, no matter what you called them. They still served the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and we're still going to find that out. Daniel, lion's den. Remember that story? The 3 Hebrew boys in the fiery furnace. Remember that story? They still didn't bow. They still wouldn't burn. So there's a lot of life lessons in this thing for us. One other thing, I know I keep saying that, but I keep thinking of stuff to tell you. Book of Daniel, 12 chapters. If you would want to know this, from Daniel chapter 2, verse 4, all the way to chapter 8 is written in Aramaic. Chapters 1 and 2, verse 1, 2, 3, and then chapter 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 is written in Hebrew. You say, why is part of it written in Aramaic and why is part of it written in Hebrew? Remember this. When Daniel's talking to the Jews, he writes it in Hebrew. If he's talking to the Babylonians, he writes it in Aramaic because that's what they speak, the Chaldean language. Isn't that something? So if it's something they need to know, and he's preaching to them, he writes it in Aramaic. All right.